And for that very kind recording in progress. I love how you threw your voice like that. That was very impressive. You are a woman of many talents. And okay, this meeting's being recorded. Got it. Just don't tell the witness relocation program. We're fine. And I just wanted to clarify one thing, and that is that my name was Lyons before I was interim associate dean of Roar. I just wanted to make that clear. I'll let that sink in for a bit. That did not get the roar of laughter I was expecting. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're up front and I'll buy you a beer after. All right. If not two. All right. Well, I'm ecstatic to be here and I'm ecstatic to share something which has been a really remarkable journey for me. I've been a rare books librarian for almost 2 decades, and I've come to really appreciate the human element of this, and I'll explain why in a second. I owe a great debt of thanks to the niece of Roy States, a woman named Margaret States, who is a prolific teacher, has a bachelor's and graduate degree in education, spent many years in community colleges and the public school system in Quebec and Nova Scotia, is the author of a historical biography, if you can see, called Gooseberries Have Thorns, and is also, and this is the great gift she's given to us, has put together a biography of Roy Wellington States. Now, this is very important for us, and it's very important for posterity, and it's very important for what it means to build a collection, because I'm going to get into a philosophy of that with you. Sir William Osler, one of the most important people in the history of medicine, a Canadian, but because he wasn't a hockey player, no one knows who he was outside of the field of medicine, was also a great collector and founded one of the best collections of medical history in the world, which is here in Montreal at McGill, and it's called the Osler Library of the History of Medicine. So his philosophy of a library, a collection of books put together often by an individual, is that it represents the mind of its collectors, his fancies and foibles, his strengths and weaknesses, his prejudice and preferences. Particularly is this the case if, to the character of a collector, he adds or tries to add the qualities of a student who wishes to know the books and the lives of the men who wrote them, the friendships of his life, the phases of his growth, the vagaries of his mind are all represented. So the idea is the library is a great collection of the whole, and I'm honored to say Mrs. Margaret States is here now with us. Anyway, welcome. I just said I just gave your biography, what a great person you are, and I'll let you know, as you asked, I put in a plug for the book. I want my my cut, eh? All right. Okay, so this is why it's important to understand a collection, because you can learn so much more. I'm going to use an analogy, and the analogy is this. Do any of you like going to antique stores? Yeah, okay, good. You ever notice you go to antique stores, you look around, you find old photo albums, and you look them, or you go to a garage sale or something like that, you find a box of old pictures or photo, and you look at it, and you can say to yourself, oh, these are interesting, they're nice photos, look, there's family at Christmas, an old car, you can see all these cool things. But that's it, you're looking at pictures. You don't have the context, you don't know the family, you don't know the people, you have no way of going beyond the image in front of you. This is what a collection of books could be without the knowledge of the person who collected. It's an assemblage of things which are fascinating, interesting, but you don't have the heart, the soul of it, which is, who are these people? What were they doing? So what I want to convey to you in the time we have together is just who was this man, Roy Wellington States? Why was he collecting and what was he trying to accomplish? So it brings what could be a 1 or 2 dimensional thing and makes it 3-dimensional, and more than that makes it living, which I love stories, and I love to share the stories of the collections that I have had the good fortune to curate. And here comes my mother-in-law and my wife, so I better watch my language, or I'm going to get a clout in the ears before you know it. All right, so the framework I'm using to interpret this collection, I call the 3 C's. So the first element of it's consciousness raising. So what the books meant to Mr. States as a collector? What was he trying to do? What was bringing him into building the collection he did? By the way, the collection itself is a spectacular collection of African Canadian, African American, African history, and during his day, contemporary material related to the Black experience, particularly in Canada, but not exclusively so. I'll get into the details later, but just to let you know what it is. The second thing is the collecting itself. What was he collecting and how was he collecting it? And the third point is communicating. What was he doing with it? So if you think of it like the books provide, there's the desire for the knowledge. The knowledge is what helps with the consciousness raising, and the consciousness raising then in turn gets expressed. And this is what Roy States was as a collector. People collect for different reasons, but this was his. So here's the man himself. I'm going to give you a brief biography of who he was. I've never met him myself. I've had the good fortune, thanks to Mrs. States and others in the collection itself, to get a sense of who he was. And I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to meet him because he sounds like a heck of a guy, if not else. So a somewhat brief life, 1919 to 1980. He's born in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. His family is, this is an element of Black Canadian history not everyone knows. His family were free Blacks who came as United Empire Loyalists and settled in St. John, New Brunswick in 1783. So early of the United Empire Loyalists. Like anyone of good sense, they left St. John as quickly as possible. I have a place in New Brunswick, so I can say this, all right? None of you can, but well, maybe you can, but I'm getting away with it. So anyway, they moved to Nova Scotia, became prosperous farmers and craftspeople. Mr. States was born in 1919 February to a fairly prosperous family, a large house in an integrated neighborhood. So a good background. He had to leave school at age 16 because his father was blinded in an accident in a glassmaking factory. And he felt it incumbent upon himself to support his family. In 1939, when the Second World War started, 20 years old, he went to enlist, as so many people did. And in his later reminiscences said that he was told that he wasn't wanted. It's a white man's war, and we'd rather not have you serving. The following year, he was able to enlist. And as you can maybe see on the shoulder flash above his left shoulder, it's the Pictou Highlanders. So a good Highland regiment in Nova Scotia, served overseas for 7 years. So not only during the period of the actual war itself, but in the 2 years following it in occupation. He was married, had a son, and like many wartime marriages, it didn't survive the war. So he came back in 47, his first marriage disintegrated, and he ended up in Halifax. Now in 1951, he joins the CPR as a sleeping car porter, and he's working between Halifax and Montreal. In fact, I believe he's based in Montreal at this point. This is an interesting story. For those of you who are Montrealers de souche, you might remember that Little Burgundy was the first sort of Black neighborhood in Montreal. And Montreal, you have Little Burgundy, St. Henri, St. Cunegonde. And the reason the community was located there was because of its proximity to the two major railway stations, Bonaventure Station, which was CNR before Central Station was built, and the Windsor Station. So there's close proximity. Union United Church is still just off Atwater. So if it gives you a sense of the epicenter, Negro Community Center was a bit further east. Anyway, so sleeping car porters are interesting because at the period, it was a well-paying job. It was a fairly stable job. So many of the people who were community leaders worked for the railways. Roy, with his background in the military and shouldering great responsibility, and he left the military as a sergeant. I love this. He was 6'4". He's a big man. And I don't know if any of you, I was in the reserves, and the idea of any sergeant, let alone a big man like that as a sergeant, is terrifying. So, I mean, he was an imposing figure. So here's this man, he's got this job, And he found it degrading. He found it degrading to be at the beck and call of people. You can imagine maybe what the experience was like for someone in that position where your job is to take care of people. And he was a very proper and compassionate person. I don't think that was the issue, but maybe somehow the treatment was done. So he re-enlists in 1954. So he joins the military again, becomes part of the first UN peacekeeping force that goes out to the Suez. So this is quite an accomplishment. And in the 50s and 60s, based in Montreal, he starts to develop his interest in his collecting. And the collecting bug hits. His second wife and he are real partners in crime in this way. They're both amateur historians. They're going and collecting material and doing amateur historical work. So it's a good time. It blossoms. In 1969, he leaves the military. He's having trouble with his eyes. His vision's going. And then he has an operation that improves his vision. So between 1973 and 1980, he works at McGill University as special events and activities. Someone with his background, it's an ideal job for him. You know, you've got crazy deadlines, crazy stuff, 2 million things going on simultaneously. He was great at this. He really pulled it off. And we have letters in the archives from the principal at the time saying you did such a fantastic job. So he really gravitated to this kind of work and was very effective at that. All right, I'm just going to see that. He's also always involved in community activities such as the Negro Community Center, which is close by, Union United Church, other church groups, and various other community organizations, and the Legion. He's very active in the Legion as well. He was also one of the pioneers in the National Black Coalition of Canada, had several officer positions within that, and was given this award in 1979. I should say Roy was no stranger to getting awards. He received a number of them in his lifetime, including the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal. So that was very impressive. And he was also at this period in the 60s and 70s, was also going back to school. He, as I mentioned, had to leave high school. He went back to finish high school, as I suspect as an adult, definitely, but as like maybe night courses or something, and then started taking courses at Sir George Williams University, which is now part of Concordia. And he was pursuing an undergraduate degree, but his vision sadly stopped at that. So that's a brief sense of who he is. So now I want to get into the sort of like, who was this man vis-a-vis his collecting? And this is where it's really neat. And again, I'm very grateful to Mrs. States for helping with elucidating that of him. So the first, I think, major influence maybe on his intellectual life and his self-identity is Marcus Garvey. So in an interview published in the Montreal Star in 1973, remember the Star? I delivered the Star. They were huge. Like Saturday, it was like each one was like 8 pounds. And I still wake up screaming on cold winter mornings, just remembering that. Anyway, so he described in this interview in 1973, Mr. States describes how he became a voracious reader. He was a voracious leader too, but good recovery, eh? Anyway, so in 1935, when he was 16, he read an article by Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican-American leader who was a major and continues to be a major intellectual force in Black consciousness, and was really a strong advocate of Black self-awareness and Black pride. Of course, if you think of the context, you can imagine how important a message this was. So in part, after reading this article, Mr. States said how he suddenly realized, I didn't know anything about myself, my people, my own race. I began to look for information. I couldn't find any. The New Glasgow Library had 86,000 books. Atwater maybe has 40,000 books. So the Atwater times 2, only 2 were about Negroes. I began to look around to ask questions I wanted to know. It became my hobby. So years later, Mr. States quoted Marcus Garvey, when describing the continued racism of blacks faced in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, he said, he quoted, "Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will." So it gives you, I think, a feeling for how someone in a position such as he would be responding. He's seeking, he's looking, and then he's getting this reinforcement, this encouragement. And to give you a context of the era and his life, he wrote when he returned to New Glasgow, Nova Scotia from serving overseas in 1947. This is not an uncommon experience for people in Canada or the US. He said, "A curious thing happened. Before leaving, I was refused entrance into a theater there. When I came back in 1947 in uniform with all my ribbons, I was refused again." Okay, so who has a $10 bill in their purse or wallets? If you do, can I have it? It never works. Never works. A tough crowd. Anyway, if you look on your $10 bill, depending on how old it is, if it's an old one, you'll get Johnny McDonald. If it's a newer one, you'll get Viola Desmond. Do you know the story? Viola Desmond, 1946. Yes, you do. Woohoo! You can keep it. Was traveling, a very successful businesswoman, was traveling on business, was in New Glasgow, wanted to see a film, had trouble with her eyes. So she asked for a ticket in the main floor, the parterre, I guess, as opposed to the balcony. She bought a ticket, hadn't realized that it was a ticket to the balcony, but because of her eyes sat on the ground floor, was told that blacks were not allowed to sit there. She said, "I can't sit up in the balcony because of my eyes." The difference in the price was 5 cents or something like that. Manager came and said, "Get out, you can't." She said, "I'll pay the difference. I just can't see the film from up there." That wasn't good enough. Police came, literally dragged her out of the cinema, arrested her. She went to court the next day and was charged with defrauding the government because she didn't pay the 1 cent tax that she would have paid having sat down there, even though she offered to pay. That was good enough to finally legalize segregation in Canada. So the basis of that becomes jurisprudence. And so that, in effect, legalized segregation. And of course, that led to a fight growing out of this against that. Anyway, where's my sheet? There it is. Okay, so through the 50s and 60s, Roy continued to be active in civil rights activities. He was a strong believer, I think, in two elements of what I'll call the civil rights and Black consciousness. It's not the Black Power movement. He believed in knowledge for self-identity, Black consciousness, but then knowledge for other people. So it's harder if you know people and you know their history, you know what they're like, it's harder to treat them as things. So on the side of, if you look at a spectrum, if you have Martin Luther King on your left, your right, my left, your right, okay. Look at my shoes, R, L. The more the idea of love as being the dominant force of breaking down barriers of hatred. And if you think of Malcolm X, and I realize these are gross simplifications of two men who had very, very interesting and profound ideas. If Malcolm X would be more the aggressive rejection, separation, and thinking of that going, I'll use the term radical for ease, a more radical attitude towards dealing with racism, then he's definitely more on the Martin Luther King side. By the way, this picture is from the only time the two of them ever met, and that was an accidental meeting that took place, I believe, at Congress. There was maybe a congressional hearing or something. They happened to bump into each other. There's a whole book on the two of them and their philosophies, which is really interesting, if you're looking for that. Anyway, So Mr. States summed up his philosophy again in another interview that was published in the Gazette shortly before his death. So this is how he perceived the best way going forward. It would be better if we shake hands and share a beer. I agree with both. I'll just so you know. If we are to survive the next century, it will surely be as a species, not as a collection of an indeterminate number of segregated races. So that's the sort of the core essence of the man expressed at the end of his life. So I think that's profoundly important to keep in mind when you're talking about him. My wife has a question. Oh, right. All right. It would be better if we shake hands and share a beer. If we are to survive the next century, it will surely be as a species and not as a collection of an indeterminate number of segregated races. That was Roy States. That was Roy States in an interview in 1980 before his death, expressing his perceptions of the ideal way in which people move forward. So the key of promoting this vision for him was through knowledge and communication. So knowledge comes through the collecting side of things, the bringing together of information in order to then communicate that. So his library, here you have a description of what was given in 1981 after his death by his widow. And there were about 1,000, as you can see, just over 1,000 items. There are two major areas of the collection. There's books, but we don't want to say books because that's one syllable, right? It sounds simple. Books, we call them monographs in my business. So everyone thinks we're fancy, you know. So we got monographs and you've got non-monographic material, sometimes called gray literature, community newspapers, pamphlets, copies of speeches, that sort of material, press clippings. And I'll tell you a bit about the collection because again, this tells you, it links into who he was, what he was trying to do, and then how he was communicating. So here we go. I'm going to show you just some images of what he had on his shelves, which these are from McGill on our shelves. So it gives you a sense, you can see some things here. Kwame Nkrumah, Idi Amin, so contemporary Black events. So African in this case, so Haile Selassie, as you can see, or historical material. So you have biographical material of various people. The Roots, the Alex Haley book, huge. Actually, when the miniseries was made, it was first of like the blockbuster miniseries, mid-70s, I think 1974, had the largest amount of viewers ever in television at that time. So and it's a story of maybe Alex Haley's family's history that was told over probably 10 episodes or something. I don't know. I watched it. I was in grade 4. Did anyone else remember watching it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I loved it. Kunta Kinte. It was the first time I heard an African name, I think. And it was just beautiful. So the book collection, if you're looking at it, again, I'll keep the geeky part to a minimum here, but if you look at what sort of things they are, a lot of them are historical or contemporary. So the 251, and if you do Library of Congress, they're in E, D, general ones, and local history, some language and literature like James Baldwin, authors like that. So if you look at then the chronological element, you can see that a lot of them date more from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Partially because I think when Mr. States was collecting, it was what was available with what was coming on in the shelves and stuff like that. There was also a large, much more publishing in the field too, much more was available. So I want to keep that in mind, and I think this is a critical point, is the languages. The languages, almost all of them are in English. These are the books, it's not the other stuff, but it's true of the other stuff as well. Why? Because this is a working library. I know a lot of book collectors. I'm a book collector. I know a lot of book collectors who collect like very old books, often in Latin, sometimes in Greek. Do these people I know, as learned as they are, read Latin or Greek? No, but they collect books because they want the books. Sometimes we call people like that trophy hunters. They're like, they want the big titles because they have the big ass collection. That's a technical term, by the way. You can use that in polite society. Yeah, so I classify that as a big ass collection. I bought it at Sotheby's. Yes, yes. Anyway, so his is a working collection. These are not decorations. So if we look at, this is the, I love this cartoon, the anatomy of book collecting. So you look at someone's shelves, what are we looking at? So it's here, books I bought because the covers were pretty, books I look smart reading in public, books I've been embarrassed to read in public, books I've started to but can't make myself finish, books I finished but wish I hadn't. So those are a lot of the ways, but it's a funny way of looking at it, the motivation behind that. But like I said, looking at Roy State's collection, this is definitely the purpose of which was to actually feed his consciousness. So the non-monographic collection, there we look. How many syllables is that? Like 12. There we go. Fancy, fancy, fancy. This is neat. This is the gold in the collection. This was the stuff that was really exciting because this is the stuff you don't see. Books get published often, like if you think of something like Roots, probably a printing run in the millions, right? The stuff he collected, because he's doing this in the 60s and 70s, think of the period. Canada had racially restrictive immigration policies till the 60s, mid-60s. 67 comes to mind, but I wouldn't, stand in front of a firing squad and say that. I wouldn't say anything in front of a firing squad and say maybe no. Can we talk about this? Why? Anyway, so he's collecting. So we have a large influx of people predominantly from the Caribbean. Communities come in great numbers, both Francophone and Anglophone people as well. Again, the civil rights movement and the Black consciousness movement, the Black power movement is very strong. So there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of community organizing and community recognition. So there's a lot of print out there because this is a major part of communication, and he's picking this stuff up. Thank God, because a lot of this stuff no one else has. So just to give you a flavor of what this looks like, there are community presses. So some papers still exist, some papers don't. Some papers had very short print runs, but these are the community papers themselves. So we got the Montreal Oracle, Community Contrast out of Toronto, Grasp out of Halifax, which again, these are not very commonly held in institutions. And then you have more radical things, so which are probably even more rare, less. So you have the Black Liberation Action Committee of Montreal putting out this journal. Has anyone heard of this? Has anyone seen this? Has anyone know? No, this is dynamite stuff. I love this. Mimeograph. Remember mimeographs, right? Okay, were you like me as a kid? You'd sniff them, like they'd be passed out, and you'd be like, I'm sure that can't have been good for us, but we all did it, eh? Anyway, but that was what you did if you needed to reproduce things before you had photocopiers, or before you had inexpensive photocopiers. You had expensive photocopiers. Again, another level of ephemera, another level of things that just, for the most part, were not collected at the time. They weren't probably collected. They probably never saw a public library then. So if someone like Mr. States hadn't come along, chances are there'd be no known copies of this sort of thing. Again, another publication, this I find fascinating. So you've got the African Voice. So that's an interest in Canada about what's going on in other areas. Remember, media was limited then. Remember, like, okay, I'm going to go back in time. I'm 10 years old. I come home from school. I sit in front of the TV. What do I got? I've got 12 and 6, right? 12 and 6. I got 2 and 10, but I didn't like French shows, so I didn't watch them because I couldn't understand them. And so if you had cable, you got 3, 4, and 5. And so, okay, so that's it. So we're talking about what, 9 television channels and what, two local newspapers in English, 4 in French, I believe, or the other one. So that's channels. Like you can count the number of information channels on one hand, 2 hands, 1 hand if you got 10 fingers on 1 hand. But you know, think of it. So where do you find out the other side, the other perspective? You know, you have to find them in these smaller publications. They become really important for expression and communication of people who don't usually get a voice on the front page of the New York Times. This is, I find this really intriguing. Again, consciousness, okay, dealing with the Angolan liberation struggle, something published in 1972 in Richmond, BC. So it's like, this is fascinating. This raises so many questions. Who is putting this out? Who are they doing it for? And you know, who read this? Anyway, great stuff like this. No, I don't even know if we can answer that question, but that's the kind of collection this is. And then you have community things as well. Again, the other stuff that's very hard to find. I love this. This is the Quebec Board of Black Educators, who still exist. And this was an initiative of theirs, what you should know about your children and their school. The you in this are recently arrived people from the Caribbean. So like Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent's, and your children and their schools. So what they're addressing is the fact that people who come from a very particular educational system, very traditional, very British at the time, coming here and trying to understand what's going on in the schools with their kids and how it's different from what they think should be going on with their kids. So it's wonderful. You should read this. It's so interesting because it talks about the expectations of parents for how the school should be raising their kids in many ways, not just what the lessons are, but how the deportment of the kids and the expectation. And they're saying, you're letting kids get away with murder here in Canada. You're not running a tight ship, things like that. And you know, this is how you communicate with people. So it's a way of navigating a system that is foreign, that maybe you didn't think was going to be that foreign because it's Commonwealth country, et cetera, but hugely different. And to help deal with what was obviously a problem between the schools and the community with what was happening with their kids. Again, it's opened up fantastic areas of research. Other interesting thing is there's the non-Canadian material in here. It's things like this. It's the Black Panther newspaper party, several editions, several numbers, I should say, and a number of other regional press as well. So that's the collection. That gives you a flavor of it. So we go into the third of the 3 C's. We have him conscious, raising his conscious. We have him reading to do that. So it's an evolutionary back and forth. And now we have the third part, which is communicating, because this is very much a part of who Mr. States was. He was a community leader, he was a community activist, but he was fundamentally a communicator. He did this in different ways. He did write. He was a historian who would go out and research stories that other people didn't write and were interested in, largely about conditions in history of Blacks in Canada. And so he would publish clippings, he published articles in the local community press, in the Black press. He was also a speaker. He did a lot of talks. He was always apparently very happy to take on any opportunity where he could actually speak to groups. And he did a lot of it. And as you could see, this one I find interesting because it's St. James United Church. So what was originally called the Cathedral of Methodism. So it's a big church. And he's been invited to give a talk called The Clash of Color. So Black Power in its meetings, and I loved it, by Staff Sergeant Roy States. So he was very proud of his background and very proud of who he was. So it gives you a sense of what you'd expect from someone giving that kind of talk to what was predominantly a white audience. And that, again, going back to that comment of his about sitting down and having a beer with someone, shaking hands with someone, this is what he's seeing. He's reaching out. It's not, there's the pride and there's the pride of the community. He tutored a lot of Black students. He would work with them, not in any official capacity, but because he had the interest in the background. He would often do that. He would take care of kids because it's fundamental to do that, to raise their conscience. But then he also reaches beyond the community because he sees that probably as a fundamental activity. He also put together an exhibition, as you can see, because of his military background. He was fascinated by military history, and he put together, and we still have these placards because he would do this as like a movable exhibition that he did, and it said first of its kind in Canada, and I have no doubt about that. So to give you a flavor for it, some of the placards are biographical. So he collected stories of people. This is quite an interesting one of someone who fought really hard to get into the Air Force. Now, it's amazing. If you think of it, okay, 5 years, if you think of it, mortality rates in Bomber Command in the RCAF and the RAF were about 40%. So you had a good chance of being killed. But the idea of someone fighting to get into that is so interesting if you think of the dynamics of it, but breaking through that barrier like that. So part of it celebrates individuals. And then this is interesting. This is I like this because it's got such an interesting editorial element to it. It's the War Memorial in New Glasgow. So his hometown. He was from New Glasgow and he fought in the war, right? So this monument's to him. So if you can read the caption, this memorial was unveiled in the early 1930s. Black, Indian, and veterans of other nationalities were shocked at the unveiling when a Scottish piper loomed over them. It appears that only Scots from Pictou County won the war. Suggestions were made to topple the piper, denoting the lack of recognition of other veterans. Now, I don't know if that happened in 1931, but certainly given his experience in 1947, he might have felt, and I'm assuming he did feel that way. So that was his way to communicate that experience and his experience of him and other military people to the war effort. He was also, I want to say go-to guy, but that sounds too superficial or flighty. He was a spokesperson for the community and its history, and he would often get interviewed. As you've heard, I've quoted from several interviews that were done with him over the years. And that's another example of it from 1973. Now, in this case, it was reporting on a talk he had given about the importance of inclusion in high school and elementary school curriculum. So he was definitely influential in that way, that his voice was listened to. And at the risk of embarrassing Mrs. States, I'd like to end with this quote because I think it's a brilliant summation of what the collection means and what it stands for. The Roy States collection is beneficial for everyone today because one can see how racial prejudice and discrimination impacted his life and others like him in Canada decades ago. Hopefully, the words in his writings will compel individuals to mimic his voice, speak the truth, and call out injustices. Amen.